A mechanic helped a woman in the rain. 2 days later, a helicopter landed in front of his house. Ramon's old truck engine roared through the silence of the night, but it was barely audible amidst the raging storm that pounded the deserted road. Heavy rain battered the windshield like tiny stones, and the wipers struggled to keep his vision minimally clear. Ramon gripped the steering wheel tightly, the headlights illuminating the rain-soaked asphalt ahead. His body ached after a long day at the repair shop, but the satisfaction of having completed all pending jobs brought him a certain relief. The shop where he worked was simple. Like everything in Ramon's life, he had never had big ambitions. His routine was predictable. Fix cars, go home, grab a quick meal and rest. He never complained, just went with the flow of the days. But that night, something out of the ordinary was about to happen. As he cautiously drove down the slippery road, his eyes caught an unusual reflection up ahead, near the shoulder. He slowed down and saw a car stopped with its hood open and hazard lights flashing. Beside it, a woman tried to shield herself from the rain with a small black umbrella, which looked like it was about to be ripped away by the wind. Without a second thought, Ramon pulled over, turned off the engine, and grabbed a flashlight before stepping out. As soon as he set foot on the asphalt, the icy water hit him like a liquid wall, soaking his boots in seconds. "Do you need help?" he asked, raising his voice to be heard over the sound of the rain. The woman took a small step back, wary. She looked to be in her 30s, her brown hair plastered to her wet face, her large eyes alert. The jacket she wore was completely soaked, and her hands trembled as she gripped the umbrella. "My car just stopped out of nowhere," she replied hesitantly. "I have no idea what happened." Ramon glanced at the vehicle. It was a luxury model, with chrome wheels that gleamed even under the heavy rain. He approached slowly, trying not to startle her. "I'm a mechanic. If you'd like, I can take a look." She bit her lip, clearly debating whether she should trust him. The skepticism was still there, but something about Ramon's calm tone seemed sincere enough to convince her. "Okay, but please be quick." He nodded and leaned over the engine, shining the flashlight over the parts. Within minutes, he identified the problem: a loose battery cable, an easy fix for hands experienced in heavy work. He tightened the connectors and did a quick inspection to ensure there were no other issues. "Try starting it now," he said, wiping his wet hands on his jeans. The woman got into the car, turned the key in the ignition, and to her relief, the engine roared to life, running perfectly. A sigh escaped her lips, and for a brief moment, a small but genuine expression of gratitude lit up her face. She stepped out of the car and walked over to Ramon, pulling a few bills from her wallet. "Please take this. You saved me. I don't know what I would have done alone out here." Ramon took a step back, raising his hands. "No need. It was just a loose cable." "At least accept something small," she insisted, but he shook his head firmly. "I don't want money. Just do one thing for me," he said, looking directly at her. "The next time you find someone who needs help, pay it forward." Fernanda was silent for a few seconds, surprised by the simplicity of his request. Then she put the money back in her purse and smiled, this time with a sincere gleam of gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you. What's your name?" "Ramon. I'm Fernanda." "And I promise, Ramon, I'll remember what you said." The wind blew hard, turning her small umbrella inside out. The two of them laughed, a brief moment of lightness in the midst of the storm. "You'd better go before you catch a cold," Ramon suggested, pointing to her car. "You too," Fernanda replied, getting into the vehicle. She turned on the headlights and waved one last time before disappearing down the dark road. Ramon stood there for a moment, watching the taillights fade into the distance. He let out a sigh, adjusted his flashlight, and climbed back into his truck, unaware that this brief encounter was the beginning of something unexpected. On the way home, his thoughts wandered. There was something different about Fernanda, something he couldn't quite define. Maybe it was the sparkle in her eyes when she smiled one last time, or the sincerity in her voice when she promised to pay the favor forward. Either way, he brushed the thought aside as he entered his simple home. After a hot shower and dry clothes, He lay down on his modest bed, listening to the distant sound of rain on the roof. His mind was as calm as ever after a productive day, but that night, a strange feeling lingered, the intuition that something was about to change, and he wasn't wrong. The next morning, the sun flooded the small space at the back of the house where Ramon had set up his makeshift mechanics workshop. The light illuminated the oil and rust-stained cement floor. He was crouched down, wiping an old wrench with a worn-out rag, when a distant sound caught his attention. Blades cutting through the air. At first, he thought it was just an agricultural helicopter, common in the region for crop spraying. But the noise grew louder and louder until it sounded like it was right above his house. Quickly wiping his hands, he stepped outside into the yard and froze, stunned. A sleek, modern helicopter was landing in an open area near his modest home. The wind kicked up dry leaves and dust, forcing Ramon to shield his eyes with his hand as he watched the surreal scene unfold. As soon as the blades slowed down, the door opened, and a tall man in an impeccable suit stepped out, walking toward him. "Are you Ramon?" the man asked, adjusting his tie. "Yes, that's me," he replied, still in shock. "Miss Fernanda has invited you to accompany her. The helicopter is ready to take off as soon as you're ready." Ramon blinked a few times, as if expecting this to be a joke or a dream. He almost laughed. Fernanda, the woman he had helped on the road 2 days ago? Why would someone so sophisticated send a helicopter for him? "Are you sure you have the right address?" he asked, pointing at his humble house. The man smiled politely. The humble and hard-working Ramon looked at the helicopter, then at his grease-stained hands, and finally at his old faded shirt. He thought about refusing the invitation, but curiosity won over. He quickly grabbed a jacket hanging near the door, wiped his face with a rag in a feeble attempt to clean up, and followed the man to the aircraft. As soon as he climbed aboard, the blades started spinning again, and his stomach churned. It wasn't every day he flew over the city, let alone in a helicopter. The view was breathtaking, but his thoughts were fixed on one question. Why had Fernanda called him there? The flight lasted less than half an hour, but to Ramon, it felt like an eternity. From above, he spotted a vast, perfectly manicured garden, and soon, the helicopter landed in front of an impressive mansion. The marble columns and grand entrance made his old truck feel even more modest in his mind. He stepped out hesitantly, feeling completely out of place in such a luxurious setting. Before he even reached the main door, it opened. At the top of the staircase, Fernanda appeared, now dressed in a sophisticated swimsuit, her hair pulled back into a flawless bun. She looked completely different from the wet and vulnerable woman he had encountered on that fateful night. But when she saw him, she smiled sincerely, which made him relax, just a little. "Ramon, I'm so glad you came," she said, quickly descending the stairs. "I hope the flight wasn't too uncomfortable." "Not uncomfortable, but definitely confusing," he replied, not hiding his unease. "What's going on?" She let out a soft laugh and gestured for him to follow her. Upon entering the mansion, Ramon could barely take in all the details around him. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, paintings by renowned artists adorned the walls, and the solid wood furniture looked like something out of a luxury magazine. Everything here clashed brutally with the simple life he was used to. Fernanda led him into a spacious room with enormous windows overlooking the garden. On a marble table, a tray held coffee, juice, and fresh bread, but food was the last thing on his mind. He sat down on the leather sofa where she motioned for him to, waiting for an explanation. "I wanted to thank you in person for what you did for me that night," Fernanda began, sitting across from him. "I know that to you, it may have just been an act of kindness, but to me, it meant so much more." Ramon frowned slightly, not fully understanding. "It was just a quick fix. I didn't think it was that big of a deal." She paused, carefully choosing her next words. "That night was much harder than you can imagine. I was coming back from an important event, but I felt emotionally drained. I was surrounded by people and yet felt terribly alone. When my car broke down, it felt like everything around me was falling apart. And then you showed up." She took a deep breath before continuing. "You didn't try to take advantage of the situation. You refused my money and even asked me to help someone else in return. That touched me deeply." Ramon remained silent, processing her words. He had never imagined that a simple act of kindness could mean so much. But as he looked into her eyes, he realized that in some way he had done more than just fix a car that night. He had restored something in her, something he didn't even understand himself. Ramon lowered his gaze, feeling an unfamiliar discomfort. With all these compliments, he didn't see anything special in what he had done. Anyone would have done the same. "No, Ramon, believe me, many wouldn't have," Fernanda said firmly. She stood up, walked to a nearby cabinet, and returned with a white envelope in hand. As she handed it to him, her expression was serious but full of warmth. "Inside, there's something that could change your life." Ramon took the envelope with trembling fingers, and when he opened it, he froze. Inside was an amount of money he had never imagined possessing. It was enough to pay off all his debts and still live comfortably for the rest of his life. Before he could say anything, Fernanda broke the silence. "But that's not all. I want to offer you a job. I need someone with your heart and character to help me with personal and philanthropic projects." Ramon's heart pounded, his mind flooded with conflicting thoughts. It seemed too good to be true. He swallowed hard and asked, "But why? Why me?" Fernanda held his gaze firmly. "Because you're not like the other people around me. You see beyond appearances." He looked back at the envelope and then at her. His world had just turned upside down, and he knew that from that moment on, nothing would ever be the same. The soft rain tapped gently against the tin roof of Ramon's small house, creating a melancholic rhythm that matched the thoughts tormenting him. Sitting in his modest kitchen, a cup of cold coffee between his hands, he stared at the white envelope on the table. The money was still there, untouched, like a silent presence challenging him to make a decision. It was tempting, a single act of kindness, and suddenly his simple life could change forever. He could finally stop worrying about fixing the roof, about overdue bills, and about the old truck engine that stubbornly refused to start on cold mornings. But Fernanda's offer wasn't just about money. It was an invitation to something bigger, and that scared him even more. Sighing, Ramon got up and stepped outside into the yard. The cool night air sent a shiver through his skin. He pulled up a wooden chair and sat beside the small shed where he kept his tools. The scent of damp earth was comforting, but his mind remained restless. The day before, he had discussed Fernanda's proposal with his friend and neighbor, Jose, a retired farmer who stopped by every morning for coffee. "What do you think?" Ramon asked as they drank coffee under the shade of a tree in the yard. Jose scratched his chin, thoughtful. "Depends on what you want out of life, Ramon. If you're looking for security, that money can give you that. You could close your workshop and live comfortably. But if you feel like there's something bigger you're meant to do, maybe this offer is more than it seems." "And that's what confuses me," Ramon replied. "I'm not used to change. I've always lived a simple life. Working in a place like that, alongside a woman like her, feels like a dream." Jose chuckled softly. "Dreams can become reality, or nightmares. You've always been cautious, my friend, but sometimes change isn't a bad thing. The question is, are you willing to take the risk?" Now, alone in the yard, Ramon reflected on those words. It wasn't just caution. He was afraid of losing himself, of leaving behind the life he knew and stepping into something uncertain. And then there were the ghosts of the past. Suddenly, he stood up, grabbed his jacket, and walked toward the old cemetery a few blocks away. When he reached his father's grave, he knelt before the simple headstone and ran his hand over the cold stone. "What should I do, Dad?" he murmured, his voice heavy. "I know what you would say. Don't trust anything that seems too easy." He closed his eyes and let the memories take over. He had been just a 12-year-old boy when he watched his father, also a mechanic, go through one of the worst financial crises the family had ever faced. Someone had offered him a once-in-a-lifetime deal, a quick fix for all his problems. Desperate, his father invested everything he had and lost it all. The deal was a scam. From that day on, Ramon watched his father drown in debt and guilt. That was when he learned to be wary of easy promises and to value hard work. His father's premature death had been another devastating blow. Now, standing before that headstone, Ramon felt the weight of the past and the uncertainty of the future. He knew that whatever decision he made would change his life forever. Ramon had been forced to grow up fast, setting aside his dreams to take over the workshop and keep his home afloat. Now, years later, he faced a choice that seemed to challenge everything he had learned up to that point. Sitting beside the grave, he recalled Fernanda's words, "You see beyond the surface." She seemed sincere, but part of him still resisted believing that someone so wealthy and influential would want to help him without expecting anything in return. Back home, he found an old photograph tucked away in a box inside the cabinet. It was a picture of his father standing beside an old car they had repaired together. Ramon smiled, feeling a mix of nostalgia and longing. His father had taught him the value of honesty and hard work, but he had also left him carrying the burden of a mistake that wasn't his. Now, Ramon wondered if he was holding on to the past out of fear of making the same mistakes. In the days that followed, he tried to get back to his routine at the workshop, but he couldn't focus. Every time he tightened a bolt or lifted a car hood, his mind wandered to Fernanda's mansion, the project she had mentioned, and the impact they could have on people's lives. One afternoon, while repairing the radiator of an old car, the phone rang. It was Fernanda. "I don't want to pressure you, Ramon, but how do you feel about the offer?" He hesitated. "I'm confused, to be honest. It's not an easy decision." "I understand," she said gently. "I know we haven't known each other for long, but I want you to trust me. I wouldn't make this offer if I didn't believe you were the right person." After the call, Ramon sat on a bench near the workshop and gazed at the horizon. Suddenly, the world he knew felt too small. The doubts were still there, but something inside him told him that maybe it was time to take a chance. That night, before going to bed, he got up and took the envelope with the money. Instead of opening it, he placed it at the bottom of the dresser drawer. The money could wait. What really mattered was understanding the true meaning of that proposal. He lay down, closed his eyes, and whispered to himself, "Maybe it's time to trust." The next morning, Ramon knew what his answer would be. The helicopter flew over the green hills, and he looked out the window with a surprised expression. A mix of anxiety and curiosity filled his chest. With every mile he moved away from his modest home, he felt like he wasn't just leaving behind the place where he had lived for so many years, but also an important part of who he had always been. The decision to accept Fernanda's offer hadn't been easy, but now there was no turning back. His heart pounded as he adjusted his seatbelt and took a deep breath. The helicopter began to descend over the mansion's vast garden, and a slight nervousness took hold of him. It was the same feeling he had the first time he had been there. The memory came back vividly. The vibrant flowers around the helipad, the crystal-clear fountains, and the uniformed gardeners. It all looked like a scene from a movie. This wasn't a place where he felt comfortable, but he was here for a greater purpose. The helicopter door opened, and a uniformed staff member helped him step out. Fernanda was waiting at the entrance of the mansion with a warm smile. She wore an elegant white blouse and tailored pants, but her posture was relaxed, almost informal. "Welcome, Ramon. Ready for this new journey?" He let out a nervous laugh and ran a hand through his short hair. "Ready? I don't know, but I'm here." She laughed, understanding what he meant, and gestured for him to follow her. As they walked through the spacious hallways, Ramon tried to hide his amazement. Everything seemed meticulously designed: the marble floors, the Persian rugs, the paintings that were probably worth more than his entire house. But, contrary to what he had imagined, Fernanda didn't seem interested in showing off her wealth. She wanted to get straight to work. "The project I told you about over the phone starts tomorrow, but I thought it would be good to introduce you to a few things first," she explained, as they walked down a corridor decorated with photos of philanthropic projects her foundation had carried out. "We'll be working in a community called Vila das Flores. Many families there are struggling financially. We're already renovating the local school, but we also want to build a community clinic and improve the water supply system." Ramon nodded as he observed the photos. Many showed smiling children alongside volunteers at construction sites. Others depicted Fernanda visiting families in difficult situations, always with a determined look in her eyes. "Sounds like a massive undertaking," he commented. "It is," she said, stopping in front of one of the photos. "But that's why you're here. I have a lot of people helping me, but I need someone who pays attention to the details and truly connects with people. When I met you that night, I realized you were that kind of person." Ramon looked away, still a bit uncomfortable with so much confidence being placed in him. Deep down, he still wondered if he was up to the challenge. The next morning, at dawn, they set out for Vila das Flores. The community was just over an hour away, but it felt like a completely different world from Fernanda's mansion. The streets were unpaved. Some houses had walls and roofs made of worn-out wood and rusted tin. Children ran around old bicycles, and skinny dogs barked at the visitors. When the car stopped, Fernanda stepped out confidently, greeting a few people who seemed to recognize her. Ramon, on the other hand, got out slowly, trying to take everything in. This wasn't the first time he had seen poverty. His own life hadn't been easy, but something about this place touched him differently. Maybe it was the mix of hope and hardship in people's faces. The first place they visited was the school under renovation. Part of the building had already been painted, but many classrooms still had cracked walls and broken windows. Ramon was introduced to the principal, a man with graying hair and a tired yet hopeful gaze. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Ramon," the principal said, shaking his hand firmly. "I understand you'll be working with us now. We need all the help we can get. The pleasure is mine." "I'll do what I can," Ramon replied sincerely. As they walked through the school, he met other residents, including a group of construction workers rebuilding the structure. Before long, Ramon joined them, grabbing a shovel and helping to level the cement on the ground. Fernanda watched from a distance, a subtle smile on her lips. "You adapt quickly," she commented, approaching. "This I know how to do," he replied without stopping his work. "The hard part is dealing with everything else." Later, Ramon was taken to meet some of the community's families. In one of the houses, he met Dona Rosa, an elderly woman raising her grandchildren alone after her children had left for the city in search of work. She spoke about the struggles of lacking clean water and medical care. "All we want is opportunity," she said, holding the hand of her youngest grandson. "It doesn't have to be much, just enough to give these children a decent life." Her words stayed in Ramon's mind for the rest of the day. When they returned to the mansion that night, he was physically exhausted, but felt something different inside him. Something he hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. For the first time, Ramon understood the true meaning of Fernanda's proposal. It wasn't just about renovating buildings or fixing pipes. It was about transforming lives. As they sat on the mansion's veranda drinking coffee, Fernanda observed him closely before asking, "How do you feel after your first day?" Ramon stared at the cup in his hands, a faint smile forming on his lips. "Different. Like, for the first time, I'm doing something that truly matters." She nodded, satisfied. At that moment, Ramon realized that neither the mansion's luxury nor the money mattered. The real challenge lay in the faces of the people he had met, in the opportunity to create meaningful change. Fernanda was right. He wasn't there just to fix things, he was there to make a difference. And standing beside her, he was beginning to believe that maybe he could. The soft hum of the car engine and the sound of dirt roads crunching beneath the tires filled the silence between Ramon and Fernanda. The morning sun cast a golden light over the landscape as they drove to the inauguration of the newly renovated community school. Ramon watched the green fields stretch to the horizon, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought about how much his life had changed in the past few months. Since accepting Fernanda's offer, his routine had become a series of unexpected challenges and intense emotions. They spent most of their time together, solving problems, sharing responsibilities, and, in the rare moments of rest, talking about everything. Their friendship had formed naturally, built on mutual respect and admiration for each other's work. But lately, Ramon felt something different growing inside him, something he tried to ignore. "You're really quiet today," Fernanda commented, interrupting his thoughts. He turned to meet her gaze. She was beautiful, as always. Her hair was elegantly tied back, though a few loose strands danced in the wind. Ramon smiled slightly and looked away, as if caught in the act of something. "I was just thinking about everything we've done so far. It feels like years have passed, but it really hasn't been that long." Fernanda nodded, resting her arm on the car window. "I know how you feel. Our routine has changed completely." "It really has," he chuckled. "You pulled me out of a life where all I had to do was fix engines, and now I'm here, helping to build schools. You've always done more than just fix things, Ramon. You just needed someone to show you that." Her words caught him off guard. A warm sensation spread through his chest, but he stayed silent. They fell into a quiet stillness again, each lost in their own thoughts, until about half an hour later they arrived at the village. The community school was simple, but with the renovation, it was unrecognizable. Walls painted in vibrant colors, new windows, and a courtyard where children played excitedly. Seeing the joy on the students' faces filled Ramon with pride. They spent the morning at the inauguration ceremony, cutting the ribbon and watching student performances. Ramon was eventually pulled into an impromptu soccer game with the kids, while Fernanda spoke with the residents. At the end of the event, the two stepped aside, enjoying a quiet moment before heading back. "I have to admit, watching you play soccer with those kids was one of the funniest things today," Fernanda teased, laughing. "Hey, I used to be a great player," Ramon protested. "I just slipped twice." They both laughed, but soon the laughter faded into a different kind of silence. Not uncomfortable, but full of unspoken thoughts, of emotions that seemed ready to surface. Fernanda stopped near a tree, leaning against the trunk, while Ramon bent down to pick up a stone from the ground and gently tossed it onto the grass. The wind blew softly, as if the world around them was waiting for something. And maybe, for the first time, Ramon was ready to listen to what his heart had been trying to tell him. "Ramon, can I tell you something?" Fernanda's voice was more serious than usual, making Ramon look up. He realized this wasn't just a casual comment. "Of course," he replied, feeling a slight tightness in his chest. Fernanda took a deep breath before continuing. "That night, when you found me on the road, I was at my limit. No one knew. Everyone thought I was a strong, confident woman who had everything under control. But in reality, I felt completely alone." Ramon watched her in silence, taking a subtle step closer. He knew this wasn't easy for her. "My whole life I've been surrounded by people who only saw my wealth, but never the real Fernanda," she continued. "And that night when the car broke down and they left me there in the rain, all I wanted was for someone to truly see me. And then you showed up." Her eyes were slightly damp, though no tears fell. Still, Ramon felt a knot form in his throat. He had never imagined that night had been so significant for her. "I never knew that," he said softly. "You had no way of knowing. But somehow, you saw something in me that no one else did, and I'm grateful for that." Ramon swallowed hard, feeling a flood of emotions rising inside him. Without thinking, he held her hand for a moment. A simple gesture, but full of meaning. "I understand what you mean," he admitted. "When my father died, I felt completely lost. He was the only person I could truly count on. After that, I had to be strong. I learned not to depend on anyone." Fernanda gently squeezed his hand, encouraging him to continue. "I always thought that if I stayed in my comfort zone, I'd be safe. I wouldn't risk getting hurt again. But then you showed up, and everything changed." They stood in silence, side by side, as the wind blew softly around them. Both knew that the words spoken in that moment went beyond what either of them could fully explain. There was something growing between them, something silent but intense. When Ramon let go of her hand, he felt an immediate emptiness. He took a few steps back, trying to organize his thoughts. He was confused, torn between the genuine friendship they had built and the new feelings that were beginning to emerge. From the distant look in Fernanda's eyes, he knew she was struggling with the same uncertainties. "I think we should head back to the car," he said, breaking the silence. "Yes, of course," she answered, a bit hastily. On the way back, the air between them was heavy with unspoken emotions, but at the same time, there was an unspoken understanding that this moment had changed something. It was as if they had crossed an invisible line, and now they had to figure out how to deal with what they found on the other side. Ramon stared out the car window, trying to process everything they had shared. He knew he could no longer ignore what he felt for Fernanda, but admitting it would change everything. And beside him, Fernanda kept her eyes on the road, the same whirlwind of thoughts reflected in her gaze. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, bathing the construction site in golden light, making it look like anything but an ordinary project in progress. Fernanda held a clipboard, jotting down details from the engineer while the workers around them finished the final touches for the day. The community clinic project was almost complete, but there was still work to be done. On the other side of the site, Ramon was helping carry wooden planks for one of the workers. Even after months of working alongside Fernanda, he still couldn't get used to how different she seemed here. With her feet firmly on the dusty ground, dressed in simple clothes, and her hair slightly messy from the wind, she was nothing like the untouchable rich woman he had imagined when they first met. She was real, and that confused him more and more. He paused for a moment, wiping the sweat from his forehead, and watched her from a distance. There was something about her that held him, something that went beyond admiration for the work they were doing together. It was the way she smiled while talking to the locals, as if every word truly mattered. It was the way she looked at him, as if she could see him completely, without judgment. In the past few days, Ramon had tried to understand what was happening inside him, but the more he tried to suppress his feelings, the stronger they became. And from the way Fernanda looked at him sometimes, a fraction of a second longer than necessary, he knew he wasn't the only one feeling this confusion. As she continued watching, Fernanda took a few steps toward a precariously stacked pile of wood beside an unfinished structure. The wind was blowing stronger, and Ramon immediately sensed that something was wrong. The planks were poorly placed, swaying with the movement of the air. Fernanda screamed, but had no time to process the warning. Ramon sprinted toward her, just as the sound of the collapsing planks filled the air. He reached her, grabbed her tightly, and pulled her away, both of them tumbling to the ground, rolling through the dirt as the planks crashed down beside them. Ramon's heart pounded wildly as he looked at Fernanda, still lying beneath him, her eyes wide with shock. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They just breathed heavily, trying to process what had just happened. "Are you okay?" Ramon asked, his voice rough. Fernanda heard him, but she didn't answer. Her eyes were locked onto his, and Ramon realized that it wasn't just fear that left them frozen. There was something more between them, something they had both been trying to ignore for so long. Fernanda opened her mouth to say something, but before any words came out, a tear slipped down her cheek. She quickly tried to wipe it away, but Ramon caught her hand, stopping her. "Is something happening?" he asked gently. "I don't know what to do anymore," she murmured, her voice trembling. "I've spent weeks trying to convince myself that this isn't real, that I need to keep my distance, but I can't." Ramon felt a tightness in his chest at her words. What he had been trying to deny was now laid bare between them, and there was no turning back. Fernanda started to speak again, but her voice faltered. She didn't know how to explain what was happening inside her, how to put into words the same conflict that was consuming him. "I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself that it was just gratitude, that the admiration I feel for you is only because of who you are, because of the work you do. But that's not it. It never was. Fernanda took a deep breath but didn't pull away. On the contrary, she moved closer, as if she had been waiting for this moment since the day they met. "Then why are we fighting it?" Ramon whispered. But he didn't get an answer. All he knew was that in that instant, the reasons that had kept him at a distance no longer mattered. He leaned in slowly until his lips met hers. The kiss started hesitant, as if neither of them could quite believe it was really happening, but soon it deepened, filled with all the repressed longing they had been holding back for so long. When they finally pulled apart, Fernanda rested her forehead against his, closing her eyes as if trying to etch the moment into her memory. "I'm so afraid," she admitted in a near whisper. "Afraid that this won't work, that our differences are too great." Ramon cupped her face in his hands, making her look at him. "I'm afraid too, Fernanda, but what I do know is that I don't want to lose you, and I won't let that happen." She gave him a small smile, a mix of emotion and relief. The weight they had both been carrying seemed to lift at that moment, as if admitting their feelings was the key to unlocking the door that had kept them trapped. Slowly, they stood up, still holding hands. Around them, the workers had gone back to their tasks, but for Ramon and Fernanda, the world seemed to have paused for a moment as they walked out of the construction site together. A thought crossed Ramon's mind. The changes he had feared so much had already happened. There was no going back, but for the first time, that didn't scare him. Fernanda gently squeezed his hand, and he knew he wouldn't face this alone. They were in it together, and that was enough. The sun shone over the small village, where Fernanda and Ramon had decided to visit once more before taking a break from work. The community clinic, which had once been just a project on paper, now stood tall, its white walls gleaming under the daylight. Children played in the schoolyard next door, and the locals greeted them as they passed. That scene, so common in their new routine, still touched Ramon's heart. He watched as Fernanda crouched down to talk to a little girl, holding a red balloon. The way she smiled at her, asked about school, and showed such genuine care for every detail of the work they did together, filled Ramon's heart with an unexpected warmth. He smiled to himself, remembering how it had all started so improbably, that rainy night on the road. He had never imagined that the desperate woman standing beside a broken-down car would become the most important person in his life. When Fernanda returned to his side, they started walking along a quiet path leading to the village. It was where they usually discussed the next steps for their projects. But that afternoon, Ramon had something else in mind. "Is everything okay? You seem different," Fernanda asked, noticing his unusual silence. He let out a nervous laugh and ran a hand through his hair, trying to find the right words. The wind blew softly, and the distant sound of birds filled the air. It was the perfect setting, yet Ramon felt like a nervous teenager. "I was thinking about everything we've built so far," he said, looking toward the horizon. "Not just this place, but everything we are." Fernanda furrowed her brow, but her eyes were filled with warmth. "What are you trying to say?" Ramon took a deep breath, and with a slightly trembling hand, pulled a small velvet box from his jacket pocket and knelt before her. Fernanda was speechless, her hand covering her mouth in surprise. Her eyes shimmered with tears she didn't try to hide. "I'm not a man of big speeches," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "But from the day I met you, my life completely changed. And not just because you gave me a chance, but because you showed me that I can be more, do more, love more." He gazed deeply into her eyes, hope written all over his face. "Fernanda, do you want to keep building all of this with me? Will you be my wife?" For a moment, Fernanda couldn't speak. Tears streamed freely down her face as she nodded, saying yes in silence. Ramon slipped the ring onto her finger, and before he could even stand, Fernanda threw her arms around him. They laughed together, still holding each other tightly, and Ramon felt as if time had stopped right there on that hillside. There were no more doubts, no more fears, no more differences between them, only love. The garden of Fernanda's estate was decorated with white flowers and string lights hanging from the trees, creating a warm and magical atmosphere. The soft sound of a violin filled the air as friends and family settled into their seats around the lawn. Ramon was nervous, but the moment he saw Fernanda walking toward him, dressed in an elegant white gown that looked as if it had been made just for her, an immense peace washed over him. She was the woman he loved, and in that moment, everything they had been through seemed to have prepared them for this new chapter. During their vows, Fernanda spoke about how Ramon had become the anchor she never knew she needed, how he had shown her that true wealth wasn't found in material things, but in the human connections we build. Ramon, in turn, spoke about how Fernanda had made him believe in himself and how, together, they could continue making a difference in the world. The kiss that sealed the ceremony was met with warm applause from everyone present. Ramon knew without a doubt that this was the beginning of something even greater, something he had never imagined. The next morning, as the sun rose over the horizon, the couple sat on the veranda of the estate, cups of coffee in hand, their bare feet touching the cool floor. There was no rush. It was a quiet moment before they returned to the work they loved so much. "What comes next?" Fernanda asked, resting her head on Ramon's shoulder. He smiled and looked at her. "Now we keep doing what we do best, helping people. But this time, as a family." Fernanda sighed contentedly. "I have an idea. We could expand the projects to other villages, create something bigger, maybe a network of community clinics and schools." "I like the idea, but one step at a time, right?" he teased, making her laugh as she nodded in agreement. Just then, Fernanda's phone vibrated with a message, probably something about the project, but she ignored it. This moment, right here, belonged only to them. Ramon knew the work ahead would be intense, that they would face challenges and that there would be difficult days. But none of that mattered. What they had found was far more valuable than any project or recognition, the love that united them and the shared passion for changing lives. The wind blew softly, rustling the trees around them, and Ramon felt at peace. He had traded a simple life for a world full of possibilities. But what made him embrace this new path was knowing that, with Fernanda by his side, he would never have to give up who he truly was. They looked at each other, sharing an unspoken understanding, and Fernanda took his hand. Together, they knew this was only the beginning of their journey, but they were ready to face the future as partners, not just in work, not just in love, but in everything life had in store. Because in the end, their true legacy wouldn't be measured by money or completed projects, but by the lives they touched along the way. And right there, in that moment, with the sun shining and the future ahead, Ramon and Fernanda understood that what they had was more than enough. The love they shared and the unshakable trust that made them unstoppable. They were ready to take on the world, one step at a time, always side by side. Did you enjoy today's story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with your friends. See you in the next video.